Afternoon, how y'all doing? My name is John Toner. I'll be representing the private sector perspective. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap between all of our different perspectives. For better or worse, the private sector came up with an overarching point of importance, and that for us is the bottom line. Can the GPI be relevant to the bottom line of investment in the private sector? And within that, we came up with kind of three minor points. One, public reputation, particularly with CSR. Also, an investment strategy, as well as a political and public-private relationship. So on the first point, public reputation and CSR. Public reputation in the private sector is very, very important. Obviously, BP is a more recent example where any kind of negative press is bad for the business. So a GPI could be used as a benchmark for investment success. Companies could approach governments and say, our investment over the past 5 years is directly correlated with a more safe society. As well, part of corporate social responsibility could be specifically targeted at reducing the GPI, a much more safe society. So for instance, now we discuss green movements for CSR. We might start talking more about anti-violence education, for instance. In other words, a very, very targeted corporate approach towards the GPI. At the same time, because there is no international institution that oversees movements like corporate social responsibility, it might hurt the competitiveness of different corporations. So while some corporations might be very responsible and they might find that, yes, it's profitable, in some nations that might not be a priority. And so it could be an issue for competitiveness in the international market. At the same time, the investment strategy could be very much affected by a GPI. Obviously, it's going to come up in a risk assessment for countries. And all else equal, it could tip the scales in favor of one country over another. For instance, tourism, as we've mentioned, is an industry that's directly related to an overall perception of safety. Now, there's a double-edged sword with that. If you, for instance, see that some countries are less safe than others, it might detract from economic development because of a lack of private sector investment. At the same time, we would look for more specific indicators. One of the things we mentioned in previous discussions is that certain regions can be more or less safe or more or less violent. So in a more urbanizing global scheme, you have some very, very violent cities, but in the countryside and other parts of the country, it's relatively safe for investment. So again, a GPI could be good for some indicators, but bad for others. And so therefore, a more localized approach to looking at GPI is better for the private sector use. The third part is the public-private relationship. Part of the essence of private sector power is that governments will have to come to the table and say, we want to invite investment, we want multinational corporations to invest in our country, but MNCs could then say, we're going to invest, but we're only going to invest in responsible countries. For instance, a number of free trade agreements now incorporate labor law regulations. Companies could do the same thing using GPI as a benchmark for whether a country is meeting those criteria. Another aspect of the political public-private debate is that if some elements of a public spending budget go towards conflict reduction, it might hurt other aspects that could help the private sector, such as infrastructure development. So balancing these two things within the perspective of international investment is very, very important, and we'd like to see a more specified indicator base for the GPI. And lastly, in thinking about the bottom line, we do believe that there is a concept of liberal peace, that countries that are more involved in terms of their economic relationships are more peaceful. However, this is not the only indicator, and that we do find that with these recommendations and seeing it as relating to the bottom line, it can be more relevant for the private sector.